You're live.
All right, I'm going to call to order this Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, Tuesday, September 19th. Please all rise to the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Chair, Mr. Weisgerber sent me before you begin,
Yes.
note that he would be just a few minutes late. He had an extended commute.
Okay.
So,
Do we need a motion to excuse him until he arrives, or should we call roll first?
You call the roll.
Okay.
Please.
Let's please call roll then.
Mr. Redmond,
Here.
Mr. Weisgerber, Mr. Parker,
here.
Mr. O'Neill,
Here.
Mr. Bateman,
All right, do we have a motion to excuse Mr. Weisgerber until he arrives? He is running late and in traffic.
To excuse Mr. Weisgerber. Second.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill, Mr. Bateman,
Yes.
Mr. Redmond.
Yes.
4-0, motion carries.
Okay, the only one item on the agenda, it's case 2023-06, initiation of zoning text amendment for short-term rentals. This case has already been in front of us. Is it 2 meetings? I can't remember, 1 or 2. One meeting,
One or two meetings.
1 or 2 before. So we've seen this. I'd like to keep the meeting to the point and as brief as possible so we can go through this. And the city's done a lot of work on putting together the language, and I think it's well done. So I just want to try to coordinate anything we think might need to be maybe amended a little bit, but not. I don't want to rewrite the whole code while we're sitting here. That's the intent of this meeting. I think the intent is just to make sure it meets the intent of what the city's trying to do here. So could you just give us a brief overview?
Sure. Thank you, sir. So basically what we looked at, and just resetting the conversation on short-term rentals, really the easiest way to explain the approach that we looked at is we don't want to over-regulate them, but we don't want to under-regulate them. So we're sort of looking at the proverbial Goldilocks approach here, what's just right. And so I think we can look to the Planning and Zoning Code, specifically because the zoning code, these are land use matters. And so one of the best provisions that you have in the zoning code is the conditional use process, because it provides the commission with the ability to have some discretion over a specific use. It's not permitted by right. It's not permitted by accessory. It's permitted, but there is a review process. And with that also becomes the public hearing. So in a sense then, on a neighborhood level, the neighborhood also gets to participate in the decision-making process to weigh in as to whether this is appropriate or not, depending on the circumstances of the neighborhood. And so that guided this approach as to how to regulate these, somewhat similarly to how hotels and motels are regulated. That was another part of that. If you look at the table of permitted uses, you can look at motels, their conditional uses in some districts. Hotels, very similar. Bed and breakfasts, special exception, which is sort of the same concept of the conditional use. And so we looked at that for our inspiration. So what are we doing here? Well, we're defining short-term rentals. What is a short-term rental? It's really any rental less than 30 days. And you say, well, does that involve hotels, motels, or bed and breakfast? No, because the definition specifically excludes that. And we have those definitions already included in the code. So, but we wanted to be inclusive in that regard with regard to single family detached, attached, multifamily attached, duplex, triplex, whatever types of units. So we tried to be all inclusive on that definition. And then what the approach we looked at was, well, what districts would they be likely to occur where you would have residential? Because what short-term rentals are essentially, as I explained a little bit, it's property owners monetizing the value of location and taking advantage of a real estate asset and turning that into a quasi-commercial enterprise. And so you look to where would those uses be most likely to occur? Well, these are all, you could have some in the business corridor. We could exclude those or not. If you do have, some multifamily influence in that, but all of these districts, you're going to see predominantly single family, two family type residents. So again, with the conditional use process, it gives the commission the ability to review that. And then moving forward into the code, I've been provided with a myriad of materials from me, our public safety folks on these things. And really, what are we trying to regulate? Well, we're trying to regulate time, manner, and location, but we're also trying to ensure that there are reasonable ground rules for the use. And what that was really driven to was safety in consultation with the life safety folks. So the bulk of the regulations pretty self-explanatory. You got to go to the conditional use process. General conditional use standards apply. So you have the catch-all plus these code-specific provisions. You have requirement for smoke detectors, requirement for extinguishers, carbon monoxide detectors. Dryer vents have to be vented to the outside. GFC. A lot of these are building code things, and the reason these are important is because many homes were built prior to these current standards, and that is perfectly satisfactory and fine if it's used as a permanent residence. And by no means are we going in and enforcing people. You have to put GFCI outlets in and all that. But the concept goes, if you touch it, you fix it. And so by and through the conversion process, if somebody's going to monetize the value of their location, they should take these steps to do that. This was an ad. This was a late ad on the enclosure with the hot tub, pool, whatever, just having alarms on the doors or safety covers. Actually, this is just safety covers, audible alarms on the doors. We can look at that or not. Entry and exit plan, because people that are staying are transient. They don't necessarily know the house. I can tell you every short-term rental I've ever stayed in has an entry and exit plan, posted. It has, we put some basic ground rules on what's a guest room. Has to be able to accommodate, a sleeping device. It has to have a functioning door. It has to have a lockable window. Talking about ground rules for occupancy, no more than 10 total, respective of children or adults. Basically, it's monitored on a guest room and square footage basis, and we developed that with consultation with the building official. On parking, that's an important topic in the city, so we want them to dedicate one off-street parking spot for each 2 guest rooms, which seem reasonable, particularly when you think about the different types of housing in the city. So a lot of the homes in the West Loveland district, those could be 2 or 3 bedrooms. So they would need to provide some off-street parking. Similarly, you may have larger homes where they have larger driveways. No on-premise advertising. Obviously, we don't want billboards on houses. We want emergency contact information, a small placard, to delineate that, and then just that you have to comply with fire code, board of health, property maintenance. Just you have to comply just the same as anybody else would. And then the last thing was, how do we deal with those that are already here but we aren't tracking? And so the thought is, if this regulation moves forward, they become non-conforming uses, and so those uses can remain. But there needs to be a trigger point in how long should those remain, and they frequently call that a sunset clause. If you remember with the food trucks, there were some discontinuation clauses. There were things like that. The one thing, well, how do we capture these folks if they're active and they're non-conforming? Because we don't know what we don't know. You get 2 years to get an inspection. So you're on notice. We'll go out. We'll do the best we can. We'll pull the Zillows, the Airbnbs. We'll go to all the big sites and look and send letters out like we did with the lighting ordinances to folks and just say, hey, be advised, we adopted this. You may want to conduct a safety inspection. And then discontinuation for 6 months. We thought that was reasonable because unlike the food trucks, occupancies of residential properties tend to turn over more slowly than commercial properties do. So that was the rationale behind that. And that really is the essence of the regulations that we're proposing.
Real quick, do we need to admit Mr. Weisger? We said we have a motion to admit him back to the meeting then, since we said it was.
I'll put them in the minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do, I think to make this, and we have this scheduled for an hour, and I'd like to keep it within that time frame. We'll go through comments. I think we can to keep it efficient. If there's specific comments and specific language, I think the city's done a good job of putting it together. But if there's specific comments that we need to address, or if there's something that is blatantly missing, some big piece that we think should be added, we might want to talk through that too. So I don't know if we want to talk through that. Let's talk through the language first, I guess, and then we can kind of work if there's maybe a big piece of the puzzle that should be added that we might want to look at. So yes, Mr. Weisger.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts, and one, I appreciate Mr. Wright going through that continuum within the code from hotel, motel, all the way down to somebody basically capitalizing or commercializing the value of their property. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this discussion was just that. Where do we fit in this continuum when we talk short-term rentals? I was a little concerned, and I think you have it covered under 8C with regards to guest rooms. If somebody has a guest room in the basement, that they have a lockable window that's an emergency egress in case there's a fire. Again, making sure from a building code and safety, what I see here is putting in the requirements to make sure there's people that stay there are safe. All right. And so the other thing that I was kind of thinking through, and I had mentioned to Mr. Wright, was, we have an inspection process for longer term rentals. If you were to rent your home to somebody or lease your home to somebody, and this happens quite a bit in the Heights, we've instituted in the code an inspection process using the fire department. How does that trigger? Is that the same kind of inspection process that we're using to look at these standards? What triggers the difference between the two?
So we would identify a short-term rental as anything that would be less than 30 days, right? And I think that 30-day cutoff is a good cutoff. That is just, you have to draw lines on it. And so within these regulations, there is an annual inspection requirement here. And again, we didn't want to confuse or muddy the issue that, do I have to do a rental registration? And no, we want to keep them separate. And so, and in the rental occupancy rules, short-term rentals are excluded. So that's very clear. And so, but we wanted to come up with
that's in the inspection part of the code.
That's in the 1330.
Yep.
Yeah, that's part of our code of ordinances. But we wanted to provide for an inspection process in the short-term rental regulations that would be codified in the zoning code that sort of mirrors that to a certain degree, just in the extent that they would review, they would get permit to operate. So you get a conditional use, you walk through the process sequentially, you apply for the conditional use is granted, you come get your permit for a short-term rental, you get a zoning certificate, you're good, right? You got to go get your inspection 30 days after the date of issuance, all right? So they do an inspection, and
they being
Loveland
LSFD.
Sims, who also completes the rental registration
Okay,
occupancy. So they are skilled and do this.
That not our zoning department.
No, so these are going to be people that are used to looking at those issues, again, mirroring that process for this as well. And then as I went through with the non-conforming uses, what we wanted to make sure of is that if they're non-conforming and you want to preserve your non-conforming status, you have to go get your safety inspection within 2 years. And what we're looking at is if you look at B1 through 9, and if that's really the meat of the regulations, I would say the who, what, where, when, why, and how part of the regulations, the smoke detectors, the monoxide detectors, extinguishers, GFCI outlets, the alarms, occupancy plan, guest rooms, making sure those are identified, and then, making sure that the maximum permitted occupancy is posted. And because we recognize there are some properties that may not be able to meet item C, item D, that are, they may not be able to meet those because they already existed. And, it's hard to penalize somebody after the fact, right? So if they're able to get their inspection, they're safe, they're pre-existing, we know where they are then because of the inspection. That sort of allows us to make sure we keep the running list of that. And again, this is very different than, I think the rental occupancy program has evolved from, and Mr. Kennedy can speak to this, it's really evolved to, we catch them as we need to catch them, right? And it's an informational, we don't have somebody out knocking on doors asking somebody, let me see a copy of your lease agreement, you know, who's your landlord. But as we get them, the program builds. And so similarly, that's sort of the mind and how we approach this was, let's find out who's out there. We'll send out notice to who we think they are. And then, you know, the new ones we'll catch, and it'll build over time. And, you know, we may get some that were non-conforming that did not get their safety inspection, and they'll have to come through the process.
Follow on detail, really, and while you have parking highlighted, if somebody's going to put pavers in to widen their drive or whatever, let's say they have 4 guest rooms, they want to have 4 off-street parking locations, and their driveway can accommodate 2 vehicles, so they want to widen that out. Because it's most likely in the zone they're going to be, whether it's residential or other, we're going to hold them still to setbacks.
They would have to be held to the setbacks. I mean, we would treat them no different than any other residential property.
Okay, and that's, again, I'm not sure this triggers back to the residential code, or where does that trigger?
It would, in my opinion, you have to treat a residential property.
Mhm.
This is why I say quasi-commercial use. The underlying conversion and the improvements still are going to be looked at from a residential code compliance standpoint. So if you're in the RMD, we're going to look at those setbacks. We're going to make sure you're limited on your impervious surface ratios. We're going to make sure that, you know, if you got a house with a detached garage and you never had a driveway and you add an extension onto that to get 2 more parking spots, that we're going to make sure we look at that applicable portion of the code to make sure that goes.
And is that, again, from an enforcement perspective, what I'm struggling with a little bit is the trade between what we do from the zoning office today, right, where we do building inspections and what we're from a permit perspective, versus the safety inspections with LSFD.
Right.
And is that, again, my ask is to make sure from a staff perspective, it's clear who owns that role and responsibility as we do this, right? I'm good with what we're trying to do. I'm not poking at it. Where I see the gray confusion is who's going to own which part of that inspection and compliance part of this.
So in my mind, the way, and again, we could add clarity to this, but in my mind, the safety items, we'll call them B1 through 9,
Mhm.
those are going to be exclusively the purview of LSFD as part of that inspection,
Like
And-
they are now.
like they are now. And they may call Paul in, you know.
And that's okay. So long, and again, to me, this isn't, like, that discussion is an agreement within the administration on how you choose to handle it.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't have to be codified in code.
Right.
I just want to make sure that it's understood within the organization who owns which part of this.
Yeah, and I think that would be clear, because I think with the rental occupancy inspections, we've been able to refine that.
Okay.
And again, a lot of those complaints, because we catch a lot of more complaints, they usually originate with property maintenance,
Mhm.
and then there's sort of a dispersion to zoning, and then also to LSFD, depending on what the use is. Because when we get a complaint, and again, I'm going to parallel this to a rental, we don't necessarily know it's a rental. The complainant may say it's a rental. We don't know. We investigate it. We find out it's a rental. Ralph is our first contact, usually. In this instance, this may be complaint driven. It may be, inquiry driven. It may be whatever. But I would see that the process that we have set up now, we would absolutely mirror that. They would essentially be the same functional processes.
Okay.
So. Yes, sir.
I'd like to just weigh in on that, because I think Mr. Weisgerber makes an interesting point in terms of the scenario where an owner of a short-term rental would like to make a significant property improvement where the purpose is really for the exclusive commercial purpose of that property. For instance, to make a large entertainment deck so that this home could host, graduation parties, like much larger groups of people, something like that. I'm just curious. I know it's not necessarily in your conditional use, but I'm curious what the course of action would be for that property owner to get that approval to make those changes, and then
Building
does the staff and do our committees and commissions have a sort of point of view around that sort of mixed use zone in a otherwise restrictive zone?
There's really two ways you can look at it. And as Eva pointed out, if somebody wanted to add a deck to a property that was a non-conforming, because there's really two issues. You have the non-conformings, and then you have the new ones that come into you. So I'll start with those first. So I would argue that if there was a conditional use approval and there was a site plan that was filed, any change in that could be reviewed to determine if it requires additional review from the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I would say that in that particular instance, and again, we'll be reasonable. If somebody wants to put a 40 by 40 party deck on with a gazebo and lights and a pavilion, you're going to come back to the commission. If you want to put a 10 by 20 deck on the back of your house, we allow those in a residential district. That's a decision that staff needs to be empowered to be able to make consistent as long as it meets the requirement of the code. So the question is, it's interpretive in that sense. Are you enhancing the property, or are you fundamentally changing the use of the property? And some of that's administrative. You have to there's some discretion in that. No lie about that. The non-conforming uses, again, a little bit more of a gray area because they're here now, and we don't know they're here. And so as long as they're operating within the boundaries that we've set in the other, the holistic regulations that we have on the impervious surface, on the decks, the accessory buildings and all that, I would say those are all going to be administrative. So does that answer your
Well,
question?
a little bit, yeah. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking of some outlying scenarios, certainly. But again, I think that it's defined now in this version of the code, and so therefore it may be ruled on in terms of different scenarios separately as its own entity, right? So there may be instances where it's behaving like a different zone than what it sits in, based off of either improvements to it, or again, I don't know. I have another thought too. Just I'm trying to understand a little bit about the sort of falling off of the conditional use.
Mhm.
So the property, it says towards the bottom there that after 180 days of no residency, I guess, then it would no longer be considered a short-term rental. Does that conditional use then go away with that action, or
there might be
they wouldn't be subject to an inspection, right? That's how I read that.
Right,
They would
right.
no longer be subject to the annual inspection, but would they have to go back and get a conditional
They
use
would.
again?
Yes. So what that clause specifically refers to, you've got this sort of applies to the annual inspection required. That applies to your conditional use granted ones, right? And then you've got this section, non-conforming uses, which sequentially, okay, so it's a non-conforming use and it exists. You got to deal with them. You got to let them. They're coexisting or whatever. But if they discontinue for more than 180 days, they would that provision right there shall not be reestablished except in conformance with these regulations. So then, if they come in and it's 181 days, and we ask them for proof, and okay, we're going to ask them to show us your last occupancy, show us a last, where you had a reservation, 181 days. And I'm sorry, you have to go through the conditional use process. You have, and it could be 180 days. It could be 1 year. We could go with the
I
2
think
years.
That's a fair number, because I think that reflects what is the ideal turnover that's existed in short-term rental. So
Right.
I don't disagree with that. I just wanted to understand what the process of that is. Because,
Right.
It is sort of an emerging industry, right? And certainly the safety aspects is something I am in favor of, and I appreciate the separation from rental inspections, but also the process being the same of the actual inspection. So that's some standardization there. That's good. But I imagine people investing in properties in Loveland, buying properties, the setup to become a short-term rental could take 2 years. So certainly getting this out there, having it available to people is going to be good to give them sort of a roadmap of the rules of the road, as it says.
But don't you think that also that's one of the complaints that comes with these are when they are in the middle of Pheasant Hills, and it's every Saturday is crazy because it's my neighbor house down. So now it's all about the parking, it's all about the noise. Because I know when this first started in Law and Ordinance, before Corey recommended we go for the zoning route, which is a better way to do it, that was sort of the issue was from a public property value, from a peace, quality of life thing for a resident who lives in a typical Loveland subdivision. It could be in the city at this point in time would say, well, we really don't have any way to regulate it. So this is one of the ways to regulate it.
Well, and I mean, from a community 20,000 foot view, we have a shortage of single family housing, and so I'm not exactly sure that we want to, make this a fertile ground for Airbnbs to be popping up investment properties for short-term rentals. Because Loveland is certainly a popular place to spend time. So I think we do need to strike a balance. This does a fair job to look at it from a safety perspective, but also from a control, community control and community standards standpoint. So yeah, I just had a couple of questions, and I appreciate you addressing them.
Yeah, a couple other thoughts. One, I do appreciate the paragraph F, which is kind of the catch-all, which is, look, if you're violating any other of our ordinances, whether it's noise or property maintenance or whatever, you've got it covered in a simple, applicable kind of catch-all paragraph. Having people volunteer that they're doing this, you'll always get the 80-20 rule. So, 80% will do the right thing, 20% won't, and then we'll have to deal with it. But as far as the 180 days go, I'm kind of mixed, because when you think about outdoor use, park, river, recreation, some of these things could be quite seasonal. And 180 days may or may not be sufficient for the seasonal use or utilization. I think we're going to have to launch and learn, kind of figure out what works and see if that becomes a hindrance or not. Because, again, I think to Mr. Bateman's point, 180 days, if they're not actively getting people to stay there, maybe they should do something else with the property. Right. So I'm okay with leaving that as it is. The thing that probably this doesn't cover, and Mr. Wright and I discussed a little bit, is if you have folks who have a 3-4 bedroom house, their kids have moved out and gone to college, they now rent one of their bedrooms out to somebody. That's different than renting a house. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think, as we discussed, I'm okay leaving this and not trying to cover that separately, because that, in my mind, is not an overall commercialization of their property. And so trying to describe it as you have, and I appreciate that, where you're trying to rent the property, it becomes more of that commercialization, and it's easier to draw that line, to not try to go after somebody or try to regulate somebody who's renting 1 or 2 of their bedrooms to somebody who's staying with, family, friends, or other. Yeah. So I see a clean distinction there.
I'll be renting out my son's bedroom while he's in college. Wouldn't count.
Would not count. Not my opinion. You don't have to modernize your house.
Oh, right.
How are you doing?
But
Might charge him
yeah, well,
to come back.
and when he has a party, I'd like to see the invite, but that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I have just two things. Well, I have more, but some have been answered. And under owner, do we need to find that besides persons or persons appearing on the county tax register as entity, because there are several
Trusts,
trusts.
things, yeah.
That's not a trust. Is not a person. LLCs are not persons. That would be a Joe Braun question.
I could certainly run that past Mr. Braun, but I totally agree with you because I've seen that in a lot of real estate contracts.
Trust are not persons or people. They're
So-
definitely excluding people.
So it should say the owner shall mean the person, comma, persons, comma, or entity.
Yeah,
Say ownership entity.
Watch this. Other ownership entity appearing on the county's current tax duplicate as the owner or owners of the fee simple title to the said real properties.
Right.
Okay. Let me hit save on that one. I don't want to lose that one.
That's a good catch.
and then the last one in BB.
B.
Each guest room. Okay, you have it.
Okay, so I got B. Which one?
BB.
BB.
B8. B8 guest room. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Each guest room shall have a closet. Why do we care if they have a closet?
To be, and again, I talked to Paul about this at length. So I don't know if anybody's done real estate, looked at houses to count as a bedroom, you have to have a closet. Yeah,
Part of the definition of the bedroom.
like when you sell real estate, I mean, yeah, to count as a bedroom, it's got to have a closet.
I don't.
I mean, I guess we could delete that.
That affects safety if we're worried about safety.
Yeah. Is this a safety?
I think it needs to at least read it. It has to have a window.
The other ones, I'm fine with the other ones. I just don't know why we should care if it has a closet.
Where are we? Where am I at here?
B.
B.
Right.
B.
So is
So
the definition of guest room sufficient that we don't care, and they could have them in every room? You could put a mattress or an air.
My closet has a window. It fits a mattress.
and I'll tell you the reason why that was in here. Was that, well, I have a 7-room house, and
Yeah.
I put a mattress in my living room. I put a mattress in my family room.
Mm-hmm.
I put a
But
mattress in the bedrooms.
you're capping it at 10. So
Right.
you're essentially capping it at a 4-bedroom plus the 2 extra.
It could what that could do is it could be an indicator of space,
Mhm.
of like reasonable accommodations for a person to stay. And because I've stayed in an Airbnb where every room had a bed,
Right.
and some of them were small,
Yeah.
spaces.
Mhm.
Right.
But some of the houses in Luckman are small too.
Yeah, like I said, I don't want to get. I know we want to be expeditious of time here.
Yep.
But again, I don't know why we would be
Yeah.
regulating. If it meets code, I don't care if it meets what a definition of a rental is or a house to sell. If it meets code, we shouldn't be. I mean, saying that you have to go put a closet in a room.
So one thing I would, do we want to? I don't know that we want to cap the total. So
We
what
are
did we
capped.
say? We said 10, right?
You're 10.
10 persons, irrespective. So I guess if you want to go 2, if you want to use the rule of 2 here,
You got five
you
rooms.
get 5 guest rooms. So a short-term rental shall be limited to a maximum of 5 guest rooms. Would that,
There's no need defining
You
that.
don't need to define. You don't need to.
You're already
double-
defining it below.
Yeah, you don't need to double dimension it.
you just want to delete this section now?
Yeah, I think that would be. I don't know why we need that.
Yeah, it's
Fine.
It's
It doesn't bother me if it's
Okay.
taken out. Yeah, I guess question 2 is the 10-person occupancy. What if they have you kind of address with the noise ordinance and stuff. What if they have a party and they bring in 25 people show up and jam it? I mean, is that
They're going to get tagged under a noise ordinance
that's what
violation,
that is.
probably.
not necessarily. Not if you're not like the old
Well,
folks
that's
who
why.
live betterly. But they're gonna get you underneath the parking spaces.
Yep.
And the 10.
And that would be for new ones. That would be for new ones.
because that's one of the concerns
Right.
the neighbors have is that because I've got my cousin lives in Texas and they've got the same problem with the rentals next to them, and she said they just come and have big parties all the time.
So, you know, we've probably got a handful of them right now. I'd say we don't have 100. We don't have 3. We probably got 10. So, you know, and again, you can't write regulations for the 1%.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
I think you got a lot of things covered here that you launch, you see where the few exceptions might be and whether a change needs to be made. You know, when you talk about 10 people, you're talking adults. You know, if you have a family that comes in with 5 kids, you know, they're going to stay, they're going to go visit grandparents or somebody else. You could exceed the 10-person rule, although they're not all adults.
Right.
Right. So you got to leave a little flexibility for, you know, different family sizes and different purposes. I don't want to get too overly restrictive to the point where people start asking the question, who's an adult?
well, and it's a living document, as we've said many times. So we can always come back and tweak it if we need to. So,
Well, I think it says if they don't meet these, they've got to come in front of
Yeah.
conditional use anyway.
Right.
In front, so there's always that control mechanism. Okay. Do you have any other
I don't
questions?
know. I think this, I appreciate the amount of work
Yeah, no, this
staff's done to kind of think about how this, you know, as Mr. Bateman and I talked about, and I talked to Mr. Wright, we sit in this whole continuum of hotels, motels, all the way down to people renting the bedroom because their son moved up college, right? Where does this fit? How do you slice it and dice it so that we're not boiling the ocean? But this applies specifically to a specific need to regulate some of what is changing. I mean, I appreciate Dave's comment about the closet. I stayed in a B&B recently. House was built in 1835. You know, they didn't have closets, right?
hooks on the wall, right? Yeah.
They had hooks on the wall.
Yeah.
They had, you know, a place to put your luggage. There was no closets, right? It just was, the house wasn't built that way.
Right.
I don't want to get too overly restrictive and thinking I'm building a brand new home to do this.
Right.
And if it's a historic home, you might not want to do that in a historic home anyway. You know.
I have, my home doesn't, every room does not have a closet.
Yeah.
Every bedroom does not have a closet in my house.
Yeah.
Built in 1900.
So, all right, can we make a motion then on this? Thank you.
Sure, I'll move to it. Initiate a zoning code text amendment to part 11, title 1, section 1.
One point of clarification.
Yes.
We're in a work
You're
session.
in a work session. You got to exit.
No action.
Oh,
You got to exit the
I
work session
apologize.
before you take any
Yep,
formal
thank
So,
you.
action.
do you want to just end the work session and I bring this back to you in October?
Yeah.
And then we would
You can,
Otherwise,
clean.
it's not very clean.
yeah, right. People could accuse you of having something.
got it. Yep.
But
No, I
do you want-
misread this. I was looking at it, thinking
Yeah.
it
Do
needed
you
to
want
go.
to make after you end the work session and I will bring this to the commission in October for a formal action and then
I think that works. Yes, thank you.
That's appropriate.
perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll move to end the work session.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.